let's kick off with today's presentation. Basically, we're going to cover a couple of different fields. The first thing, I want to look at the training pipeline and what we've got coming down the pipeline. And we're going to look at challenges to fitness in those that are starting to join and those that are going to come through this pipeline into the future. And we're going to see some of the problems that are lying out ahead of us. And hopefully we'll look at how best to address them. And there's a bright light there, which doesn't look like it's doing anything. Okay. So as you all know, and I'm going to touch on all of these, and I'll give you some statistical examples just because it's research and we like research. We know there's an increase in sedentary behavior in our youth. I'm just going to focus on basically 18 and under at this stage. We know it's also happening in the elderly, in our age population. I was going to say the elderly, and I just realized, geez, that's me. So our population. We know that there's an increase in poor eating habits and nutritional content and value that is being consumed is going downhill. And I'll show you some great examples of that. With decreased physical activity, increased sedentary behavior, there's a loss of motor competency, particularly in gross motor skills. So what we call movement competency or motor competency is the ability to move well. Movement skills that you hone over time, running around a lot. Every time you go out and play as a young adult, you're actually improving your gait. You're improving your ability to accelerate, decelerate. When you're playing or used to play tag, I mean, that was the greatest, change of direction, speed and agility you could ever do. But now that we're not doing that anymore, those fundamental skills aren't being developed. And we've got this rise in obesity. Now, all these things together mean that fitness is going down. What makes it worse is that all these measures themselves actually link into each other. So, for example, increased sedentary behavior, poor nutrition means increase in obesity. All right. More sedentary behavior and decrease in physical activity means your movement skills are going to be worse. So all these things not only are 1%ers, but they join together to become multifactorial. It's a good thing because that means if you can address one of them, you can actually have on-flow effects and downstream effects for other areas, but they also feed into each other. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go through. And of course, then we had the COVID pandemic, which made everything worse. And research has shown that most of these problems here that were accelerated during COVID have now persisted post-COVID. And I'll give you some examples as we go through when I show you some of the statistics. So let's just look at physical activity. Now, there's specific areas that I want to focus on. And again, depends on which research paper you read and how they measure different metrics like moderate or intense physical activity. There will be some changes in percentages. But the key thing I want you to focus on here was, so this was 2008, so quite a while ago, about 29% of total weekly physical activity was moderate to vigorous, which is what is needed to develop physical skills. But notice as they go through schooling years, it actually degrades. So for any of you that have teenage children, going into high school, the amount of hours they now spend doing work, academic work, is increasing exponentially, and they're not out doing as much physical activity. And this is also how they communicate with their friends and live their lives online. I mean, my daughter has 3 things going at once. She's got something on TV, she's got a phone, she's talking to somebody, and she's got a laptop open doing homework because they're all communicating. That's the world they live in now. Let's look at more recent research. And now you can see that that percentage, all right, is starting to increase quite dramatically in terms of work that's not being done, sedentary behavior, which we'll look at in more detail in a sec. But the key thing to notice here is this is just physical activity now. This isn't moderate to vigorous activity. This is any physical activity. Again, notice the trend. As they get older, less physical activity. So their physical activity is going down. One other thing I really want to focus on is the amount of sedentary behavior. So even if they are being physically active for short bursts, there's a long period in which they're sedentary. Right. So that means if you get them and you train them for an hour, they go play sport for 1 or 2 hours, there's still the rest of that time, that day, that they're very sedentary. That's going to cause problems downstream, which I'll talk about at the very, very end. This is some work done by our own Kirsten MacDonald. She's one of our physiotherapy staff members, and she actually sat in classrooms and looked at the amount of activity children were doing. So not just using actigraphs and accelerometers, she actually sat in there and marked them every minute of the day for their school days. And you could see that around 86% was sedentary. Only about 2% would be classified as moderate to vigorous. So you can see that this level of sedentaryism, decreased physical activity, is increasing. They are not mutually inclusive. Right? So you can have somebody who's very physically active, but only for short periods of time. And then you can have long periods of sedentary activity. You can have somebody who's on their feet moving around a lot. So they've got a little bit of physical activity going, but it's not intense at all. So don't automatically just think that they're both mutually inclusive. This is where you start to see some of the post-COVID impacts. So if we're looking at 17-year-olds, this was a study done on 17-year-olds playing video games. You can see that as screen time increased, a whole bunch of factors, and again, those comorbid factors, those interrelated factors starting to take place. So they were less physically active, so lower levels of fitness. They also tended to eat worse while they're sitting in front of a video game and playing games, because they don't actually sit down there with a nice, 2 meat and veg healthy meal. They're normally snacking, foods high in salt, high in sugar and energy drinks. And then, of course, that leads to obesity. So these are multifactorial things that we're dealing with here. Post-COVID increase in screen time is now the new normal. And you can see it, we can see it in academia. A lot of the work that we've done, we've taken lessons online, we've developed online resources for them to do activities at home. My daughter's schooling, all her homework now is online. So beforehand, they used to get worksheets and something to sit down and work. Now it's all online. So this new norm is what we're seeing, where it leads to this increase in screen time, which becomes problematic. All right, so what does this mean? Well, we know that generally there's a decrease in global motor skills. We're talking, look, it's multifactorial again, but we're talking about gross motor skills, movement skills, big skills, jump, land, run, change direction, lift, push, pull, get up off the ground. Big global patterns. The movements are getting worse, and you can ask the team here. We've got a saying that quite often you'll when we do the fitness tests for Unisport, you'll actually see some movement patterns that look like baby drunken giraffes when they're running the shuttle run. And we're talking about level 1, level 2 here. The movement literacy is that bad because they haven't been running. They haven't been out there playing. And of course, you've got this post-COVID impact where for 3 years, if they were in lockdown, they did very, very little physical activity. That means they haven't developed motor schemas. Think about this downstream now. How are they going to learn use of force techniques? What's their kinesthetic awareness going to be when they're trying to control a weapon? These are all motor skills. So they're second and third order effects apart from just fitness. Something unique, it's a lot more over in the US, but something we're finding here as well is for those that are physically active, they're starting to specialize in sports at a younger age. So typically when we played sport, okay, I'm a lot older. When I played sport, all right, and we played sport at school, believe it or not, you actually had a summer sport, which was cricket, and a winter sport, which was rugby or soccer. Now you have one sport, and they specialize in that one sport from a very, very young age. The problems with that is, their general athleticism, their general movement skills is degraded. Their specific movement at a specific task, fantastic. Their general movement skills, not as good. So here's a challenge for you, because I'm sure you're all physically healthy. When you all go to the gym next time and you do heavy squats, right? Do a heavy squat, get up, walk away, come back and get ready to do another heavy squat. And you'll find that you'll put your feet in the exact same spot because that's the motor skill you've developed. You're efficient at that movement. Watch what happens when you take your feet that little bit wider. You bring them a little bit more narrow. Your movement pattern changes and suddenly you wake up muscles that you forgot you had. All right, and you end up with DOMs. So again, if you develop one skill set without any redundancy in your movement, it becomes problematic. It also starts to lead them into the risk of overuse injuries at a very, very young age. So we're seeing overuse injuries in sports, for example, at a young age. All right, and then of course, obesity. 2025, first time in human history, documented human history, that obesity, the number of children under the age of 17 living with obesity has risen above those that are classified as underweight. It's the first time it's ever been recorded in UNICEF. All right? So our obesity rates are higher than our underweight rates across the world. And of course, social media is not making it any better. So there's a whole bunch of other pressures now that most of us may not have had to the same extent because we didn't live on social media and we weren't influenced as much as our young people are by social media. So diet is becoming a problem that's ongoing, and it's now to the point where they're actually looking at huge reform changes over in the US, where they're trying to actually influence foods at schools to help mitigate the problem. Not something we've been able to do here, but we don't provide as many cafeteria lunches. So if you look at obesity rates, all right, 1 in 4 basically is classified as obese. This is the Australian specific statistics from UNICEF. And you can see how they said that, basically since the year 2000 to about 2025, this only goes to 2022, but by 2025, we have doubled a number of obese children. We have doubled. So this is what's coming down our pipeline. And as you can see, it just keeps going up exponentially. So obesity is becoming a factor that we're going to have to deal with because they're going to be the ones that potentially join. All the effects lead to reduced physical fitness. So this is an older paper, right, by Tompkinson, a fantastic paper. 55 different countries. They looked at shuttle runs. They looked at 1.2 kilometer runs and 1.6 kilometer runs. And they found this period over time where running velocity, speed, is degrading by about 0.5% per year. How do we test them to get in? Almost every agency that has a fitness test has something like a shuttle run or a run for distance. So running speed is going down. This one, Fane and Weatherford, they found this decrease in grip strength. You think, oh, okay, grip strength, that's funny measure, push-ups, sit-ups, and a run. We don't really need grip strength, and of course, unless you're doing chin-ups. But grip strength is a great surrogate measure for fitness. Because let's face it, when you all go to the gym, you don't go in there and start I don't want to assume you all don't. Most of you don't go in there and just say, it's a forearm day to day, and just start cranking out forearm work and then go home. You develop your forearms as part of global movements, pulling, pushing, gripping, holding, carrying. And therefore, it's a great surrogate measure for the general physical strength of our youth. Of course, you then add COVID, which then meant less going to the gyms, less physical activity, poorer diet, and now we've got this on-stream effect. And of course, we've got to consider the potential future implications of this, where we start to do more, or we may be exposed to more viral threats and viral loads. So if you look at the effect of COVID on fitness, and this is a great paper because it talks to exactly what we typically look at for entry standards, aerobic base, push-up base, and sit-up base, they've all degraded. So it was bad, now it's just got worse. But wait, there's more. All those things, will negatively affect fitness. But our population, our birth rate is going down. We've got weird noises. Lise?
Not anymore.
Okay. Never anger the Brazilian. Somebody just got booted probably. But you can see now that this is the latest stats that we've got from Australian Bureau of Statistics. Our fertility rate is 1.5. To maintain your population, you need a fertility rate of 2.1. So without immigration, our population is going to get smaller. Right? And let's face it, quite often with immigration, they don't typically come in at a very, very young age. You don't have a lot of influence of people coming through at a young age who then want to join your services. So that means our recruitment pool is getting smaller. And those that are in the pool are less fit, overweight, poor dietary habits, and move like baby drunken giraffes. And do they actually want to join the agencies that we're working for? All right, so that's the first thing. What does this mean for training? So these are just some of the papers that have come out of the Tactical Research Unit, and ironically enough, you saw Colin Tomes, you saw Jay Dawes, you saw, you've had magic words from the Pope, and Bob Lockie. So these are the papers that we've done with them. Green is military, blue is law enforcement, and red is fire and rescue. All those different training agencies, if you come in with low levels of fitness, you're more likely to be injured. And then we can put up another 50 references that show that quite easily. So if you go into training less fit, there's a good chance you're going to be broken. In some cases, once you get below level 7.5, in some studies, your risk of injury is now 76% that you won't get through training. When we look at a second order effect, is those that have low levels of fitness burn more energy during PT and just doing all the physical activity required of the day, which means that if they're burning that glucose, it's not fueling their brain. So they don't learn as well. So they start to fail academic tests. And this is a great study of 541 US Marines that underwent different fitness tests. So you can see there was an aerobic-based test, which was like an obstacle course, and their fire and maneuver test, which is an anaerobic explosive activity. And they related that to their potential to pass their academic tests. And those that perform poorer on the physical activity tests perform poorer cognitively as well. So you're more likely to fail tests. This was another one looking at movement competence. So they got a whole bunch of Army cadets in and they tested them on their movement skills. All right. And those that failed the movement skills test, they had an increased risk of ACFT failure, which makes sense. That's the Army Combat Fitness Test, right? If you're less fit and your movement skills are worse, you use more energy moving poorly, therefore you're inefficient and you perform more poorly. This is a study that we did with around 28,000 data sets looking at the Army's Recruit Training Center, both their full-time and part-time courses. And so that's their reserve courses of 28 days, and that's the full-time course, the 80 days. The biggest predictors of survivability going to get through training and pass the test at the end, was their entry standard, push-ups, sit-ups, and run. So how well they do when they join will reflect whether or not they pass their final gate fitness assessment, which means they should not be thinking of joining, in this case, the military to get fit. They need to be fit to join the military. This was an interesting study. I really like this one. It sort of augments some of the other work we've done, but they quantified it really well. They found that those Army recruits that were slower in their 2.4 kilometer run were 10 times more likely to end up with upper respiratory tract symptoms, which means they were immunosuppressed, which means they're more likely to get ill. Right? Illness is a big problem in many training establishments, but particularly if it's an illness that can go around and make everybody else ill. Because there have been cases where in Australia and in the US where they've actually shut down training establishments because so many people have become sick. Right? So illness is a big deal. And you can see this one here, when they were 48 seconds slower, their chance of attrition, so they had the standard, they were 48 seconds below the standard, their chance of attrition was nearly half, just not to get through training because they were sick. This is a study we did with the police, and you can see here, this is a power output, so this is vertical jump. You get this deflection point here at about 45 centimeters. If they were below 45 centimeters, there was this progressively increasing risk to around 1 in 2 getting an illness or getting sick during training. So if you put that all together, you can see that these are all the challenges, that's the impact, and that's the downstream impact when they hit training. Some other factors that influence training, however, start to fit into this as well. Some more subtle components of this, which we'll touch on. So this is a study we did, one of the first studies we did at Kapuka, where we actually stuck GPS on all the trainees, and we had a look at how far they moved. And basically, on an average day, they walk around 7.5 kilometers. That excluded all physical training. So there was no physical training in those measures. That was just moving around the area. A later study by Joe Napick over in the US found that they walk around 11 kilometers a day, or they cover a total distance of 11 kilometers per day, including physical training. That's for the duration of their training. Why is this important? This is the latest study in the Australian Army by Bulmer. Fantastic study that clocked up around 17,000 steps per day for 80 days to survive training. So those that survived Kapuka first time through clocked up around 17,000 steps per day. Now, if you think about 17,000 steps per day, you can't just do that in one hit. It means they're active all day. Now, remember, they're coming out of school where they've been doing less physical activity, less moderate to vigorous activity, and majority of it has been sedentary. Now, if you get somebody who's been sedentary for several years, and then on day one, you get them to walk 17,000 steps per day, every day for 80 days straight, you can expect a lower limb injury. That's before we do physical training. That's before we look at communal cooking. That's before we add military boots or law enforcement boots or firefighter boots or put them on the fire ground. So if you're starting to clock up that amount of distance on your feet with no preparation, you're at high risk. That means if you're going to implement any form of conditioning, it needs to evolve beyond just what you're doing in the gym for that 1 hour that you've got them. You need to educate them. You need to educate them to over the next couple of weeks, we need you to progressively spend more time on your feet, clock up more distance on your feet. Because one of the things that leads to is what we call program-induced cumulative overload. So this is a term I coined with, again, Rod Pope, my mentor, and Joe Napick. And what we use it to do is to describe all the other things that influence physical conditioning or the physicality of the body during training. So as I said, the additional distance is covered, how far they're walking around on their feet all day, every day. But then you've got other things like drill, weapons training, military unarmed combat, or use of force training, all these other physical things that they do as well, on top of the training that they do. So when we looked at, and this is one of the, ironic enough, this is the study where Ben and Shane went walking around, literally following marking steps for days in the heat. and we forgot to feed them. But we had pizzas. I think we had pizzas after the third day. And you could see the distance covered over 80 days, right? When we actually broke that down, only 12% of that came from physical training. All the rest of it came from everything else that we're doing. So again, physical training alone, just getting them in there and conditioning for an hour isn't going to be enough. When you actually broke that down, about 30% was running, about 30% was walking and moving around the area, and about 40% was pack marching or walking around with a pack on their back. All right. So about 30% of the 12%, right, was running. Problem is, quite often when they do this training, they do it as a group, and group training is critical. Develops esprit de corps, develops communication, it develops camaraderie. All the research about, why soldiers fight, well, it's because of the person next to them. All the research about some of the biggest detractors of survivability of training is a loss of connection with your cohort. So they train together. The problem with training together is those that are less fit have to work harder to keep up. All right. So if you're less fit, you're working harder. This is a study that was done by Dr. Ben Schramm with the US Marine Corps and the amazing Karen Kelly. And as you can see here, for the exact same march, when they're marching as a group, the female personnel worked harder. Why? Because they're female? No. Because in general, females have a lower VO2, a lower aerobic capacity. They have lower upper body strength, all right, and they're lighter, which all means you have to work harder. So if you had a very light male who had a lower aerobic capacity and had lower upper body strength, they'd be the exact same. They'd be working harder. You can't change body weight of females very much, but what you can do is increase their aerobic fitness and increase their upper body strength. And that'll help mitigate these offsets. Remember, this is just subgroup populations here. This is females in general versus males in general. So how do we go about and reduce some of these impacts? There's a variety of different things that can happen at a strategic level. Unfortunately, I don't think many of us have the power to do much of it. Like change entry standards. It would be nice. And unfortunately, knowing that it's getting more and more difficult to find people who want to join, let alone have the fitness to join, means they're going to drop the standards. All right. That's not necessarily a bad thing if you risk mitigate it. Change the output standards. You can't do that because what is needed at the end of the day to do the job is needed at the end of the day to do the job. You may have different progressions between basic training and MOS training or trade or core specific training at the other end, maybe along the pipeline. But at the end of the day, they need to reach a certain standard to be able to do a certain job. So you can change the training course length. So if they're going to come in less fit, you make the training course longer so you've got more of a ramp time progression. General adaptation takes around 12 weeks. We know that from physiology. 80 days, that's about 12 weeks recruit training. Okay, we might just start getting some things at the end of it. Except if you make the course shorter, then you've got a problem. And unfortunately, they like to make that lower to get people in and that shorter to get them into the agency sooner, which creates a challenge. So what can we do? We can improve their fitness prior to them actually joining. How can we do it? Well, this isn't new. Study by Joe Napick in 2006, and this is a really cool study. They got a whole bunch of Army recruits, they trained them, they got them in, they tested them, and they said, right, if you passed, you go into Group A. If you fail, all right, half of you we're going to give a conditioning program to until you pass, then we'll stick you in training. The other half, we're just going to throw you in training anyway and see what happens. And you can see the pass rates at the left-hand side for both males and females, 59 and 52%. Those are those that failed the entry test and then tried to get through training. So about half of them got injured. Those that were allowed to do the conditioning program, their failure rates, all right, were a lot lower. Their success rates were a lot higher. But at no stage, even with this program in place, it was never as good as those turning up who were physically capable in the first place. So it is a stopgap measure that can be applied. We did the same sort of thing at the Royal Military College. So what tended to happen is they came in and did their officer selection board. And because they only start training at the beginning of the year and 6 months into the year, so they have a 6-month block cycle of first, second, and third class. Sometimes they were going through doing all the tests and doing their officer selection board, and then they wouldn't actually come back to start training for up to 5 to 6 months. So we implemented some training protocols that they had to follow over their break and left them to it, because as future officers, you need to be able to maintain your own fitness. Then when they turned up, the PTR said, show me your logbooks. which they didn't expect. And some of it seemed to be written over 6 months. It was written in one color pen with the exact same handwriting all the way through it. Very interesting, that. But generally, the amount of failures on coming in later, 6 months later, all right, decreased exponentially to only around 5%, which was a fantastic outcome. And then, of course, what we do have here is what the ADF are doing now through Unisport, and we've got the Unisport teams here, where they're actually looking at preconditioning to make sure that they go in fit enough. And we'll touch on that, and there's a lot more detail that we'll go into that a little bit later. Canadian Armed Forces are doing something a little bit different. So what they've got is a whole online package. If you're thinking of joining, boom, here's your online package, and you can actually go on and have a look at it. Some pretty interesting stuff on there where they tell you how to prepare for your test, and they tell you about the different levels of fitness that you can use. One of the biggest problems is this ability-based training needs to be applied in this group setting. So again, if they all run together and all train together, when we actually measure how hard they're working, so this is the top 25% and the bottom 25% in that group going for a run. And you can see in red, the bottom 25% are working a lot harder, which means their risk of injury is going up. So how can you train a group all together but actually cater for individuals? So here's an example of one ability-based training format that we applied. And as you can see here, that's based on their 2.4 kilometer run time. That's based on their shuttle run level. And this is how far they go out and back on a sprint. So they all start together and they all finish together, but they just run different distances. It's great because if somebody comes in with a bit of a niggle, or something's a little bit sore, something's a little bit tender, I had a bad night's sleep, great, you can drop them down a couple of levels. You can use a 20-meter shuttle run, but instead of, you wouldn't be doing a 20-meter shuttle run over 100 meters. Good luck. I don't think you'd pass level 1. Well, that challenge accepted. But you could actually do 22, 21, 20, 19, 18, and degrade down. What that means is as they blow out at that level, they can drop down a level, because then they start to train motor speed, teaching them to run faster. All right? Whereas normally if they just blow out at that speed, they don't actually practice running at a faster speed. You can get them to do that by dropping them down a level. So we tried this with a group in New South Wales Police undergoing training, and that was led by Sergeant McSteely, and we implemented a 30-15 ability-based training program. So that's a 30-15 intermittent fitness test rather than the 20-meter shuttle run test. You can see there the control group started off a lot less fit, but actually ended up significantly fitter. What's also cool is the number of injuries during training dropped by 50%. So we dropped the overuse injuries and we actually got them fitter using ability-based training, which also meant that those that were fit did not lose fitness. Here's another example of how you can set it up using a box system. So those on the inner circuit obviously end up running less distance. And this is a study that Bob Lockie did then with the LA Sheriff's Department, applying this sort of format. And of course, we found that there was a significant greater increase in fitness, particularly in the bottom 20%, which are your most at risk. Here's an example of a circuit using an ability-based format. Again, using a variety of, you've got your key motor skills across the top. You may only have a variety of basic, this is your baseline techniques you do. So you've got a parallel lift, a unilateral lift, a pull or push, a bend, twist or rotate. Shoulder mobility and bend and lift were critical here because they're working with law enforcement in particular. So we know shoulders are a leading cause of injury in law enforcement. And then you've got your baseline, and you can see there as an example with the push-ups, modifying the push-up changes the amount of percentage body weight you're using. And then, of course, you can just load them up at the very end. So you can have a very simple set of exercises. You just know how to progress them and regress them, because they may have poor upper body strength, but their lower body work could be fantastic. So if you put them all back here for every single activity, they're going to detrain in some areas while they train in others, as opposed to actually being able to modify this. And all you need is your coach to walk along here and just say, okay, move back 2, move forward 1, etc. But the coach needs that skill. This is the example of the Army Recruit Training Center where they've actually set up platforms for that. So there's different weights and they just go forward and they select their weight and use their weight for their activity. A couple of final things to touch on. Coaching is important. Technique. We've seen how technique is degrading. So we need to focus on technique or performing skills. If I told you, when you were younger, I'd do a push-up. Your technique would be pretty good because you've jumped up, you've jumped down, you've moved, you've rolled around. Technique now for simple movements are really, really bad, to the point where a study by Bob Lockie with firefighters doing the Biddle test found that the failure rate was around 20%. I think it was 18% the first time they did it. By the time they got to their 6th attempt, it was around 1% because they learned how to do it. They learned how to do the test. And this was over a very short period of time. So they didn't get a whole bunch of extra training. They just learned the techniques. In fact, in a single session, so another study done by Ben with some of the teams in Europe, that was with Philip. I don't know how you got him on the video. That was great. With Philip over in Europe. And they looked at literally do your best effort, have a break. All right, now we're going to teach you how to do push-ups. We're going to teach you how to do sit-ups. We're going to teach you how to do a long jump. And they improved significantly just from a coaching session on being told how to do a push-up properly because they became more efficient in their movement. So that initial coaching is critical. And then finally, verbal encouragement. This is a double-edged sword. This is a great study by Nito looking at the the 20-meter shuttle run test. And what he found is they got two groups and they made them do the shuttle run test of young males. And then half the group got verbally encouraged to go as hard as they can, and they, people cheering them on and cheerleaders and whatever, yelling at them, go harder. Or an old crusty drill sergeant. I'd love that job. Just anyway, and they then swapped them over and got them to do it again. 8 levels on the shuttle run difference. 8 levels. This group was pretty fit. They went from level 8.10 to level 9.7. Just when that was the mean of the group through verbal encouragement. So it shows you how important your attitude is towards the test when they're doing it. Are you going to get up there and actually encourage them to move, to push? You'll also find that's why you would have seen it when you're actually running some of the tests, is that if you have a whole bunch drop out early, your fitter people are more likely to drop out early because they've got no one else that's pacing next to them, which is often why we make, throw Ben in the deep end and make him run with them, just to encourage that last person to keep running. It's not me, I'm too old. Robbo's in charge of the whole thing, so he can't, he won't get involved. He'll be the mentoring, and we make Ben run with his manky old broken knees. But encouragement is important. Think about how you can use that. When you train, your encouragement may be less, go harder, and more focused on skill and technique, because what you don't want them to be reliant on is somebody to verbally push them, extrinsic motivation. Because when they get to recruit training, they won't get extrinsic motivation. All right. So some of the key take-home messages, they're coming in less fit, and that's going to be a problem because that's where our future technical personnel are coming from. Challenges include sedentary behavior, obesity, decreased physical activity and movement skills, and poor nutritional habits. A variety of different things, different challenges that we have to face. COVID-19 has made these worse, unfortunately, not better. And the only way we can literally get through this at the moment is through good preconditioning, because some of those other factors are not going to change. They're not going to make the entry standards harder. They're not going to make the training courses longer. And they're not going to train the output. So basically, we have to get them ready before they join. Thank you very much.